The terms carbon credit and carbon offset are often used interchangeably, which in most situations is fine, but there are some complications that can arise with this terminology. So first off, what is a carbon offset? A carbon offset is a certificate representing 1 ton of carbon dioxide emissions that is either avoided or removed from the atmosphere. These offsets are created by emissions reduction projects in the voluntary carbon markets. Some examples of these projects would be the utilization of high-efficiency cook stoves that burn less fuel to help developing regions of the world. There's also avoided deforestation efforts to protect endangered forests, and carbon capture and storage projects that sequester CO2 out of the air and store it underground. Another interesting example to consider would be the plugging of orphaned oil and gas wells, which can leak methane emissions if they're not properly sealed. So if you reduce the methane being emitted into the atmosphere by plugging these abandoned wells, you can get some carbon offsets for doing so. Something to take note of, notice how we're talking about methane here. So carbon offsets can represent all greenhouse gases in carbon dioxide equivalents. The amount of offsets you get will vary based on which greenhouse gas you're working with. Since methane is more potent than CO2, you'd get more carbon offsets in that scenario for each ton of methane you avoided emitting. Carbon dioxide is just used as a baseline because it's the most common greenhouse gas. So how do carbon credits differ from carbon offsets? Many times the terminology will be used interchangeably, but it can become an issue when dealing with hybrid carbon markets like the one in Australia, which combine aspects of both the voluntary and compliance carbon markets. In compliance markets that are government operated, governments will hand out carbon allowances, which are permits to emit 1 ton of CO2 into the atmosphere. This is in contrast with the voluntary carbon markets, which are not government affiliated most of the time. But in Australia, there are no carbon allowances. They've combined the two different types of markets, so carbon projects that would typically be under the voluntary carbon markets are now part of the government-operated market. And when they avoid or remove carbon emissions from the atmosphere, the government is issuing carbon credits to these projects, which they call Australian Carbon Credit Units, or ACCUs. So the terms can get confused, because when we actually talk about carbon credits, we're usually referring to the voluntary markets, but in Australia, their national market actually issues what they call carbon credits. So if we truly want to be accurate with our terminology, carbon offsets are the best term to use for emissions activities in the voluntary carbon markets, although many people will still call them carbon credits as well. Carbon allowances are used in the government-run markets that issue emissions permits, and in rare cases like Australia, then the carbon units created by carbon reduction projects in that market are actually called carbon credits. Ultimately, both carbon offsets and carbon credits are used by companies to offset their carbon footprint. The differentiation is based on what markets they're utilized and created in. But moving on, there aren't any readily accessible options to invest in hybrid markets like Australia at the moment, so we'll focus on how to invest in carbon offsets. And there are 3 primary options for exposure to this developing asset class. The first one is ETFs, which offer exposure to offset futures, so you can get some relatively direct exposure there, owning futures on the underlying commodity. Next up is royalty and streaming companies. These companies will provide funding for carbon project developers. In exchange, the royalty companies will either get a royalty on the revenues from that carbon project or get a stream of the offsets, so the company gets a percentage of the offsets that project developer generates. And the last investment type is the carbon project developers themselves. These companies are the ones that actually build or work on a variety of carbon projects. And these are all the types of equities that you can buy in public stock markets right now. And if you'd like to learn more about the actual stocks you can buy, or a more in-depth video on how voluntary carbon markets work, I'll link to those videos in the description below. Thanks for watching.